November 1942. Through the stifling heat of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a massive twin-engine fighter touches down. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Rushed across the Pacific as a technological savior, it was supposed to finally crush the deadly Japanese Zero. Instead, its combat debut is an absolute disaster. In the brutal tropical climate, the complex interceptor suffers catastrophic engine failures. Worse, American pilots who attempt to pull this heavy machine into traditional dogfights are effortlessly outmaneuvered and shot out of the sky. How did a massive, mechanically fragile aircraft that couldn't outturn its enemy become the exact weapon that permanently broke Japanese air superiority? The answer isn't some convenient myth about an invincible American superweapon. It is a brutal reality of tactical adaptation and raw industrial attrition. To survive its disastrous early deployment, the men flying the Lightning had to fundamentally reject established military doctrine. They had to stop trying to force a heavy, radically different machine into the ingrained dogma of the turning dogfight. Instead, they found a way to win by integrating early radar networks, sustaining a grueling logistical pipeline, and entirely rewriting the established rules of engagement. But to understand exactly how this transformation broke the enemy's grip, we first have to look back at the desperate, bleeding skies over the Solomon Islands, the unforgiving crucible that forced this radical change in the first place. By late 1942, the airspace over Guadalcanal was a theater of pure exhaustion. The American defenders, known collectively as the Cactus Air Force, were holding Henderson Field by a thread. Every day was a battle of attrition, fought at the absolute limit of human endurance and overstretched supply lines. The primary American fighter, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, was rugged and dependable, but it suffered from a critical tactical flaw. It lacked the rapid climb rate necessary to consistently intercept high-altitude Japanese bomber formations before they released their payloads. The Japanese, flying out of their sprawling stronghold at Rabaul, faced their own logistical nightmare. To strike Guadalcanal, Japanese aviators had to fly grueling 600-mile round trips over open ocean. Yet, despite the extreme fatigue of these marathon missions, their escort fighters, the Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, retained absolute dominance in turning combat. The Zero was exceptionally light, having shed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks in favor of unparalleled maneuverability and range. If an American pilot made the mistake of entering a low-speed turning fight with a Zero, the outcome was almost inevitably fatal. The Wildcats relied heavily on early radar warnings and coast watchers to scramble, but too often, they simply could not gain enough altitude in time to dictate the terms of the engagement. It was into this desperate, bleeding airspace that the P-38 Lightning was thrust. On paper, Lockheed's twin-engine interceptor was exactly what the Cactus Air Force needed. It possessed heavy, concentrated firepower in its nose, exceptional top speed, and the supercharged engines required to reach the high altitudes where Japanese bombers operated. But Guadalcanal was not a pristine testing ground in California. It was a hostile, muddy, tropical swamp, and the Lightning was an incredibly complex machine. Almost immediately, the deployment became a logistical disaster. The Lightning required meticulous maintenance and high-octane aviation fuel, neither of which were readily available at the end of a heavily contested, improvised supply chain. On the ground, the stifling heat of the Solomon Islands wreaked havoc on the aircraft's intricate cooling systems. The liquid-cooled Allison engines frequently overheated, just trying to navigate the deeply rutted, muddy taxiways of Henderson Field. The complex turbochargers, designed to give the plane its vital high-altitude performance, proved dangerously sensitive to the pervasive tropical dust and humidity, failing at an alarming rate. The sheer mechanical attrition was staggering, routinely grounding aircraft before they even saw combat. But the greatest vulnerability of the P-38 was not found in its engines or its turbochargers. It was rooted in the ingrained habits of the men flying it. Army Air Force's pilots arrived in the South Pacific, steeped in traditional fighter doctrine. They had been taught to dogfight, to bank, pull hard Gs, and turn tightly to get behind their opponent. The Lightning, however, was a massive interceptor, weighing over 7 tons. It possessed a wide turning radius and completely lacked the low-speed agility of a conventional single-engine fighter. The American pilots had been given a machine that was significantly faster and heavier than anything the Japanese possessed. But the moment they engaged the enemy and attempted to use it like a normal fighter plane, the results were fatal. The reality of those early fatal mistakes hit the 339th Fighter Squadron almost the moment they entered the contested airspace over the Solomon Islands. In late 1942, these freshly deployed American pilots found themselves face to face with veteran Japanese naval aviators who had been flying relentless combat missions for years. When the enemy formations were spotted, instinct and deeply ingrained flight school training took over. In the chaotic, split-second frenzy of an aerial merge, an American pilot would instinctively pull back on the yoke, throwing the massive Lightning into a steep bank to engage the Mitsubishi Zero in a traditional horizontal turning fight. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of physics. As the 7-ton P-38 carved hard through the dense tropical air, its massive wingspan generated immense drag, rapidly bleeding off its crucial airspeed. Within seconds, the heavy interceptor lost its kinetic energy, wallowing sluggishly in the sky. By trying to turn with the enemy, the Lightning effectively became a huge, nearly stationary target. The Japanese veterans, flying an aircraft that weighed less than a third of a fully loaded P-38, simply tightened their own turn. The Zero effortlessly slipped inside the Americans' turning radius, lining up the vulnerable twin-boom silhouette in their sights. The losses mounted immediately. American pilots who managed to survive returned to the muddy runway of Henderson Field in heavily damaged aircraft, while others never returned at all. The debriefings in the sweltering tropical heat painted a grim, undeniable picture. A terrifying realization washed over the surviving pilots of the 339th. Everything they had been taught about aerial warfare back in the States was going to get them killed. Engaging the Japanese on their own terms was absolute suicide. Survival in the skies over Guadalcanal now demanded an immediate, radical rejection of every established instinct of fighter combat. To survive, the men of the 339th and the newly arriving P-38 squadrons had to fundamentally rewrite the rulebook of aerial combat. The solution they adopted was as brutal as it was counterintuitive, and it was an absolute, unbreakable dictate forced upon them entirely by the immense weight of their aircraft. Never turn, and never, under any circumstances, slow down. If the heavy Lightning could not outturn the nimble Zero, it had to out-energy it. The tactical doctrine that emerged was known as boom and zoom, or energy fighting. This was not the elegant, twisting ballet of dogfighting that fighter pilots had idolized in their training. It was a cold, mathematical calculation of kinetic energy and flight discipline. The American pilots had to force themselves to suppress their deepest instincts. If they made a high-speed pass at a Japanese fighter and missed, their screaming instinct was to yank the yoke back, bleed off their speed, and try to loop around for a second shot. That instinct was a death sentence. Instead, they had to accept the miss, keep the throttles pushed forward, and use their massive forward momentum to fly straight out of the combat zone, entirely beyond the effective range of the enemy's guns. But executing this disciplined hit-and-run doctrine required one critical advantage. To dictate the terms of the engagement against a highly maneuverable enemy, the heavy American interceptor needed something the Japanese Zero could not easily counter. It needed a massive surplus of time and altitude. Finding that time meant integrating the Lightning into a rapidly maturing, desperately fragile intelligence network spread across the vastness of the South Pacific. The P-38's twin Allison engines were equipped with advanced, highly complex turbochargers designed specifically to compress thin air, allowing the massive fighter to thrive in the stratosphere above 20,000 feet. But hauling 7 tons of metal up to that altitude took precious time the pilots simply did not have if they waited to visually spot the Japanese bombers. The solution lay in the humid jungles hundreds of miles up the slot, the ocean corridor leading down to Guadalcanal. Hidden deep behind enemy lines, Australian and Allied coast watchers continuously monitored Japanese airfields, transmitting desperate, coded radio warnings the moment bomber formations took off. These localized reports were fed back to Henderson Field and combined with the sweeping beams of primitive SCR-270 radar sets scanning the horizon. This patchwork network bought the Americans a crucial 1 to 2 hour head start. Long before the Japanese reached the strike zone, the Lightnings were already airborne, laboring upward in a slow, agonizing climb. Leaving the stifling, muddy, tropical heat of the runway, the pilots ascended into a brutal, unforgiving environment. At 25,000 feet, the air temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The P-38's cockpit heating systems were notoriously inadequate, often failing entirely. American aviators sat shivering violently in the thin air, their breath freezing on the inside of the canopy, frostbite gnawing at their fingers and toes, fighting physical exhaustion and hypoxia just to hold their formations. Yet, as they orbited in the blinding, freezing glare of the high-altitude sun, they possessed the ultimate tactical high ground. They watched the Japanese formations approaching far below them, completely unaware. The trap was set. Now came the brutal, mechanical execution. The mechanics of the ambush relied entirely on gravity and overwhelming firepower. Spotting the enemy formations below, the American pilots would roll their heavy Lightnings over and push the noses down, initiating a terrifying high-speed vertical dive. The massive weight of the P-38, previously its greatest liability in a turning fight, suddenly became its most lethal asset. In a steep dive, the heavy airframe accelerated violently, converting its potential altitude into massive kinetic energy. Plunging out of the blinding sun, the Lightnings easily exceeded 400 miles per hour. At this speed, they were virtually invisible until the very last second, and entirely uncatchable. As they slashed through the Japanese bomber and fighter formations, the American pilots unleashed a weapon system perfectly suited for the split-second window of a high-speed pass. Unlike traditional fighters like the Wildcat, which had machine guns mounted outward in the wings, requiring bullets to converge at a specific distance, the P-38 housed its entire arsenal tightly packed in the nose. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns and 1 20mm cannon sat directly in front of the pilot. This concentrated cluster fired a devastating buzzsaw of lead and high-explosive shells straight ahead, eliminating the need to calculate convergence angles. A pilot simply had to point the nose of the diving aircraft and squeeze the trigger. A 1-second burst from this centralized battery was enough to completely shred the unarmored, fragile frame of a Mitsubishi Zero or tear the wing straight off a medium bomber. The destruction was instantaneous and catastrophic. But the most critical phase of the attack came immediately after the trigger was released. Instead of sticking around to assess the damage or engage in a follow-up dogfight, the American pilots pulled straight back on the yoke, using the immense momentum of their dive to zoom right back up into the freezing stratosphere, quickly resetting their energy state for another pass. It was an incredibly frustrating, impersonal, and deeply mechanical way to wage aerial warfare. But for the Japanese aviators enduring the long, agonizing flight from their bases, it was a terrifying new kind of nightmare. For the veteran Japanese pilots flying out of the sprawling fortress of Rabaul, the perception of the P-38 underwent a rapid, horrifying transformation. Only weeks earlier, they had mocked the twin-engine American aircraft, easily shooting down the overeager novices who foolishly attempted to dogfight them. But now, the rules of the sky had fundamentally changed, and the physiological toll on the Japanese aviators was immense. To reach Guadalcanal, these men had to endure a grueling 3-hour flight over open ocean just to reach the combat zone, sitting in cramped, unheated cockpits, listening to the endless, deafening drone of their engines. By the time they arrived over the contested island, they were already physically exhausted, their fuel reserves carefully calculated to allow only minutes of actual combat before they had to turn back. Now, into this state of deep physical fatigue, a new terror was introduced. Sudden, explosive death rained down from above. The Japanese pilots, scanning the blinding glare of the sky, rarely saw the Lightnings until the tracer fire was already tearing through their formations. When a Zero pilot miraculously managed to spot a diving P-38 and threw his nimble fighter into a violent, evasive turn, the Americans simply flashed past, refusing to engage in the turn, and rocketed back up to safety. If an enraged Japanese veteran attempted to point his nose up and chase the fleeing Lightning, The lightweight Zero quickly bled off its speed, stalling out helplessly in the thin air, while the American easily climbed out of range. Worse, if a Zero tried to follow a P-38 down into a steep dive, the Japanese fighter's controls would physically lock up due to the intense aerodynamic pressure, and its fragile airframe risked tearing apart at high speeds. The bitter realization washed over the Japanese squadrons. Their greatest asset, the unparalleled low-speed maneuverability of the Zero, had been rendered completely and utterly irrelevant. The Americans were flatly refusing to play their game. The Japanese were no longer fighting a contest of aeronautical skill and elegant maneuvering. They were being systematically hunted in a grim, inescapable mathematical equation of speed and altitude. The result was not a single, decisive, glorious battle that shattered the Japanese military in an afternoon. Instead, it was a slow, unglamorous, and incredibly bloody campaign of aerial attrition. Day after day, the P-38s executed their high-altitude ambushes, bleeding the Japanese air groups dry. The true cost to the Japanese Empire was not just the loss of aluminum airframes, which their strained factories were already struggling to replace. The catastrophic, fatal blow was the systematic destruction of their human capital. The men flying the Zeros over Guadalcanal were the absolute elite of the Japanese naval air forces. They were highly trained, irreplaceable veterans with thousands of flight hours, men who had dominated the skies over China and led the strike on Pearl Harbor. When a burst of 50 caliber fire from a diving Lightning shattered a Zero, it erased years of institutional knowledge and combat experience in an instant. The Japanese flight training programs, which were rigid and unforgiving, were entirely incapable of producing replacements of the same caliber. As these elite veterans were slowly picked off, one by one, they were replaced by increasingly green, inexperienced pilots who were even easier prey for the disciplined American energy fighters. Without a single climactic showdown to mark the turning point, the balance of power in the skies over the Solomon Islands irrevocably shifted. The P-38 had effectively broken the back of Japanese veteran fighter squadrons through sheer, relentless mechanical attrition. The Lightning had become a lethal, high-altitude executioner, but its true strategic value was actually hidden inside its wings. Hidden within that massive wingspan were enormous internal fuel cells, which, when paired with external drop tanks, gave the interceptor an unprecedented combat radius. The Lightning was no longer just a defensive shield for Guadalcanal. It possessed the legs to escort heavy bombers and strike deep into Japanese-held territory, hitting island fortresses previously considered untouchable. But projecting this kind of air power came at a horrific physical and logistical cost. On the ground, maintaining that reach was a nightmare of mechanical attrition. Supply lines were so starved that ground crews routinely stripped down wrecked aircraft, desperately cannibalizing spark plugs, turbocharger valves, and coolant lines from shattered airframes just to keep a fraction of a squadron airborne. In the air, the toll was purely human. Pushing the aircraft to its maximum range meant locking pilots into cramped, vibrating cockpits for agonizing 6-hour missions over endless stretches of trackless ocean. They flew with the constant, gnawing dread that a single engine failure or navigational error meant a silent disappearance into the Pacific. The fatigue was blinding, pushing exhausted aviators to the absolute edge of mental and physical collapse. Yet, by forcing this fragile machine and its men far beyond their intended limits, the Americans unlocked a devastating new strategic capability. And this agonizing expansion of the combat radius would soon set the stage for the most audacious, high-stakes fighter mission of the entire Pacific War. In April 1943, that unprecedented strategic reach was put to the ultimate test when American naval intelligence intercepted and decrypted a highly classified transmission. The message detailed the exact minute-by-minute flight itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, as he conducted an inspection tour near Bougainville. The target was invaluable, but reaching him required an interception over 400 miles from Guadalcanal. No standard American fighter could fly that distance, engage in combat, and make it back. Only the P-38 Lightning, burdened with those massive external drop tanks, possessed the sheer mechanical endurance required. But executing Operation Vengeance demanded an absolutely razor-thin margin for error. To avoid detection by Japanese coastal radar, the strike force could not climb to their usual high-altitude perch. Instead, they had to skim the open ocean at just 50 feet for over 2 hours, navigating purely by dead reckoning in strict radio silence. If their compass headings were off by a single degree, or if their airspeed varied by a fraction, they would miss a target window measured in seconds, burning fuel they simply did not have. Against all navigational odds, the Lightnings arrived at the exact minute Yamamoto's flight appeared. The execution was rapid and overwhelmingly violent. Pushing their throttles to maximum, the heavy American interceptors dropped their tanks and used their concentrated nose firepower to punch straight through the veteran Zero escort. In a matter of moments, the Admiral's bomber was shredded by 50 caliber fire, plunging into the jungle canopy below. It was the longest fighter intercept mission ever attempted in the history of aerial warfare, executed flawlessly at the absolute limit of human and mechanical endurance. The successful strike was the ultimate climax of the Lightning's evolution, proving beyond any doubt that the technological and tactical reality of the Pacific Air War had been permanently, irreversibly transformed. The assassination of Japan's top admiral was the ultimate proof of a new, inescapable era, far removed from the aircraft's disastrous debut. When you look back at that massive, mechanically flawed fighter stumbling onto the muddy runways of Henderson Field in late 1942, its transformation is staggering. The P-38 didn't just win battles. It fundamentally changed the entire geometry of the Pacific War by imposing a brutal, industrialized brand of energy-based combat. Its rocky deployment proved that raw technological superiority on paper is entirely meaningless without the painful, bloody process of adapting human tactics to match the uncompromising realities of the machine. The Japanese Empire did not lose the skies over the Solomon Islands in a single, decisive afternoon. They lost through a systemic inability to counter this cold new mathematics of aerial combat. It was the profound tragedy of industrial warfare. An entire generation of elite, traditionally trained aviators, men who had mastered the elegant art of the dogfight, systematically dismantled by relentless mechanical efficiency. The clash between these two fighters was no longer just a struggle for a single island, but a fatal collision between two entirely different philosophies of war. The Mitsubishi Zero had been built as a lightweight masterpiece of aviation, perfectly engineered for the intimate, honorable duel of a traditional dogfight. But the P-38 Lightning was a cold, high-altitude executioner. It was a massive, industrial weapon that simply refused to play by those rules, plunging from the stratosphere to permanently rewrite the brutal reality of the Pacific War.